Okay, well, thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me. And I'll try to approach the question of normative supervenience from a sort of metaethical, what I think it's a metaethical position, Kantian constructivism. And I say this because not everybody agrees that Kantian constructivism is a metaethical theory, and so part of this project is to show that if we endorse this kind of normative theory, there are some mainstream problems in metaethics, such as the relation between normative and non-normative properties that become not solved, maybe, but it's certainly less problematic than they appear to be at first. And the way in which I built this paper is actually as a dialogue with David Enoch, who is defending a robust realist perspective of normative supervenience. And so it's an interesting dialogue, I think, because I do share some worries with David Enoch, but the kind of metaethics that I'm proposing is very different. It's not a realist metaphysics. It doesn't invite any sort of strong supervenience the way he defends, and yet it shares some important point. So this is to explain why I'm sort of attacking David Enoch. The first step is to clarify, I think, what Enoch, and this is the plan. The plan is, as you see, an attempt to describe an old dilemma for those who defend supervenience within the normative realism. This is a dilemma that has been defended by anti-realist, and the dilemma is between queerness as a metaphysical problem and also as an epistemological worry, and or naturalistic reduction. Robust realism tries to offer a reply to this dilemma, a way out to this dilemma, but I'm trying to show that this way out is problematic for reasons that Enoch doesn't contemplate in his recent book. And yet it involves a legal analogy, an analogy with the production of legal properties as normative properties that I would like to develop. So the Kantian constructivism is introduced as a way to develop an intuition that David Enoch has in this book, but I think that Kant had a bit, before David Enoch, about the idea of involving moral legislation, of a moral legislation in order to produce normative properties or rational authority. And so, and in the last part of the paper, I'm trying to give some details about how to produce this solution. So I'll be concerned with strong individual supervenience, the way David Enoch defends it. Supervenience names a relation of various strength, as you already saw in other papers. And strong individual supervenience is a claim that it is impossible for there to be two things that are indistinguishable in their natural properties, but they differ in their normative properties. This is a strong kind of supervenience, David Enoch says, and therefore it's exigent and requires a lot of argumentation because it's very problematic. So one problem that is considered central for robust realism as much as normative realism, the way, for example, George Edwin Moore defended it, is that either supervenience involves reduction of normative properties to natural properties, or it is queer. And this dilemma is meant to rule out normative realism as a plausible metaethical theory. And this is understood to be, in a broad sense, a metaethical theory that is not restricted to morality, but it is basically extended to all normative properties. J.L. Mackey originally aimed at Moore's definition of supervenience in concocting this kind of dilemma. And of course, Moore's definition of supervenience is much stronger than David Enoch has in mind. But I think Mackey's objection is an objection that can be aimed not only to Moore's supervenience, but also to current versions of normative realism and robust realism. Mackey writes that the wrongness must somehow be consequential supervenience, and an action is wrong because it is a piece of deliberate cruelty. But just what in the word is signified by this because, and how do we know the relation that it signifies? So the first part of the objection is an ontological objection about queerness. The second part of the objection is supposed to be voicing a sort of epistemic worries. The point here is that supervenience requires an explanation, therefore is not a trivial, it's not merely conceptual, it's not trivial, and it needs to be explained and accounted for. So what I find interesting, this is an objection that, as you know, is associated also with Jackson and Blackburn, and more recently with Ridge anti-realism. But it is a line of argumentation that is based on the presumption that the only kind of explanation acceptable for the relation between supervenient properties and subvenient properties is a relation of naturalistic reduction. The implication is at work in many arguments. And the point, the reason why I think it's important to call attention to this argument is that it already, it begs the questions against realism. And Enoch actually replies along those lines. I mean, replies by saying, as for example, Nicholas Sturgeon had replied in The Atheist, by saying, well, if you think the only explanation requires naturalism, but not only naturalism, but a naturalistic reduction, then you have already destroyed the rationale for supervenience. So the basic point I find, it's not simply ontological, is epistemological. The problem is that we are not accepting an explanation in this literature that diverge from naturalistic reduction. And so supervenience requires an explanation, a plausible explanation ought to be in naturalistic terms. Therefore, supervenience ultimately commits to naturalistic reduction, or it is simply unintelligible. Now, if we take seriously this dilemma, then robust realism is in a serious trouble, because it's forced to accept naturalistic reduction or to fake queerness. The first horn of the dilemma basically shows that normative realism or robust realism is incoherent because it claims that there are irreducible normative facts based on normative properties that are supervenient but not reducible to natural properties. Choosing the other horn of the dilemma doesn't make realism incoherent, but it makes it metaphysically problematic. And I think many realists have rebutted that question, saying that it is less problematic to endorse queerness. So Mark Platz, for example, suggests that yes, so it's a queer ontology, moral ontology is a queer ontology, and we have just to accept the view that the word introduces or accepts some kind of queer elements. The idea here, though, is again epistemological. The view is that you introduce those properties that are important or not dispensable to explain whatever you want to explain about the normative discourse. So the justification for this broader ontology, the queer ontology, is a justification that is not based on any purely metaphysical considerations. It's an explanation that introduces concerns about the explication of the relation between normative properties and descriptive or natural properties. I will use natural and descriptive properties as were they were the same thing, although there is a debate about which kind of qualification to use. But so Enoch basically repeats the strategy in replying to the argument. The anti-realist argument is to accept the slogan that Mark Platz introduces and saying the world is indeed a queer place. And the view is that this kind of reply is less costly, is less problematic than rejecting supervenience. So the view that Enoch is going to defend is that supervenience is indeed both a conceptual truth and a more specific view about the relation, and this is indispensable. Rejecting supervenience in both these cases is more problematic than accepting queerness. There are two steps in this reply that Enoch is going to argue for, at least is trying to argue for. The first concerns the problem that Jackson and more recently Ridge voice about naturalism and naturalistic reduction. And it is the view that if two properties are coextensive, necessarily coextensive, then they are the same properties. And therefore, if there is a relation of supervenience, strong supervenience among normative properties and natural properties, that kind of claim commits to naturalistic reduction. Now, Enoch reply starts with an intuitive argument. It says, intuitively, the normative and natural properties are distinct. And this means that for robust realism, it is enough to say that the alleged anti-realist argument is not conclusive against robust realism. The point here is that, according to Enoch, the argument is produced from an anti-realist perspective. So, according to Enoch, the burden of proof is on the anti-realist to show that there is no supervenience claim. And so, the fact that you have intuitions to the contrary is already a way to show that the argument is not as straightforward as the natural reductionist claims. This is a rhetoric move, I think. It's not an argument. But basically, the whole chapter, if you've read this chapter by David Enoch, is built around a dialectical, the attempt to uncover dialectical moves. So the dialectical move of the reductionist is to beg the questions about the epistemological worry. The reply of the robust realist is to say, well, you have to show that we are wrong because you started the debate, basically. And it does end up saying that there is no argument whatsoever that a robust realist can afford in rejecting the view that two sets of properties that are necessarily coextensive aren't the same properties. But the idea is that it doesn't need to give an answer. I don't feel the need to give one. The reason why supervenience, despite the fact that, as we see, we are not resting on firm grounds here, the reason why it is found indispensable, according to Enoch, is that it serves some purpose at the explanatory level. So again, the justification for Enoch is epistemological, is not a metaphysical justification. And I would like to insist on that because the solution that he offers to these dilemmas is a solution that I would qualify as epistemological, not a metaphysical solution. So he thinks that the rejection of supervenience would be a devastating loss of plausibility points. It would be a less plausible view. Now, at this point, it introduced this distinction that is cuts across the distinctions that we have heard thus far. the distinction between specific and general supervenience. General supervenience says the normative properties supervene on whatever natural property we select, and this claim is defended as a matter of conceptual necessity. The specific claim is that some normative properties, for example, the notion of wrong, in fact supervene upon some natural properties. For example, the failure to maximize utility. The example is given by David Enoch. Now, these claims are distinct and logical independent claims. They're claims that we can decide whether to call, whether they're stronger or weaker than what we thought supervenience would imply. The specific is stronger in a way because it anchors some normative properties to some specific natural properties, but is also weaker because it cannot be taken as a conceptual claim. Now, if we take general supervenience to be a conceptual claim, Enoch holds that we have no reason to find an argument for it. So he thinks that insofar as we defend it as a conceptual claim, no argumentation is needed. And therefore, basically all the philosophical work is done at the level of specific supervenience, right? The relation between some specific natural properties and some specific normative properties. So one implication that show how strong is this position is that if we take general supervenience to be a conceptual claim, what we are saying is that evaluators who deny general supervenience prove themselves to be incompetent, or at least not fully competent in using normative claims. This is accepted both by realists and by anti-reductionists, and by anti-realists such as Ridge. So at this point, he has to prove that, or he has to support the claim that there is some argument in favor of specific supervenience. And this is where the argument involves a legal analogy. The example is this. Within a given jurisdiction, there is no difference in legal status, for example, concerning prohibition of drinking alcohol without difference in natural properties, for example, age. And from this example can draw three main lessons that are lessons that we can claim to be, to concern normative concepts, not just moral concepts, right? So the lesson is that at least sometimes supervenience is more plausible without reduction. Naturalistic reduction is not an option that can be seriously explored in this case, Enoch writes. That is, for some normative properties, such as legal properties, supervenience is a better account, that is more plausible as an explanatory view than reduction. The second lesson is that at least sometimes, for example, for the domain of legal properties, specific supervenience doesn't count in favor of naturalistic reduction. And the third and the most interesting claim is that what explains specific supervenience in this case is the content of the relevant legal norms. So this is an important step in the argument because it moves from say, a domain of concern that you may have regarded as metaphysical or epistemological to a set of concerns or a set of solutions that are situated within a theory of practical reasoning or a theory of norms. The next step is an extension, the extension to moral legislation. Right? So moral properties supervene on natural properties in the same way in which legal properties supervene on natural properties via moral principles. And so he appeals to moral principles or to an ideal case of moral legislation in order to explain specific supervenience. So the analogy it emphasizes is extremely close, perhaps to the point of making it misleading to describe it as an analogy. The idea is that when you are talking about the explanatory purpose of supervenience, we invoke moral principles in the very same way in which we invoke the content of legal norms to account for this relation between legal properties and natural properties. And the reason why I find this problematic for robust realism is that by his own admission, by Enoch's own admission, the philosophical work of the notion of supervenience is done by the notion of moral principle. So supervenience represents a problem that is solved by invoking moral principles. And the philosophical work here is not done by a relation or a metaphysical relation between moral properties or normative or natural properties. It is done by invoking normative principles. But if we do choose this view, which I find appealing that we resolve the issue of supervenience by appealing to moral principles rather than to some kind of ontological grounding, for example, then it seems clear to me that robust realism is not what we want to have, because robust realism doesn't represent any distinctive solution to the problem of supervenience. And as a matter of fact, Enoch endorses the notion of analogy exactly because supervenience is a problem for realism, as the entire realists have already argued many times. So I don't want to argue again that way. So Enoch might at this point try a way out, and the way out might be, well, let's see how practical reasoning works, right? So the way in which, this is a brief paragraph where he says, the way out depends on the details of the realist account of normative principle. And the way in which he presents the way out is talking about backtracking. So we backtrack practical reasoning to the measure premises until we reach some measure premise that it is not in itself the conclusion of the practical syllogism. Now, this is problematic in many different ways. Again, this is a sort of debate that belongs in practical reasoning. It doesn't belong in metaphysics, right? So it's a disputable assumptions, a series of disputable assumptions that need a defense, and the defense is a defense that might come or might not come from a theory of practical reasoning. So the disputable assumptions concern the form of practical syllogism, the very idea of practical syllogism, the idea that there are practical laws that serve as measure premises, and a more normative question, which are those premises and how they're available to us. Now, to these questions about the form of practical reasoning and how we can invoke and defend the possibility of supervenience via this via an account of moral principle, there is a theory that I think is a direct competitor for robust realism, and this is Kantian constructivism. Now, Kantian constructivism as a metaethical theory can be defined in slightly different ways. There are different ways to define the commitments, and I take it to be a cognitivist theorist, not an anti-cognitive theorist as other people defend it, with an account of the rational cognitive content of practical judgments. I take it to be naturalist, not because it invokes reduction, but because it is compatible with a naturalistic account of the world and of the mind. And more importantly, it's not a proceduralist view. So the kind of Kantian constructivism I defend and endorse is closer to Kant's own count of constructivism than it is close to Korsgaard or other proceduralist account of constructivist. It is closer to O'Neill, for example, than to Korsgaard's account of constructivism. and it is based on a thick conception of rational agency. That, of course, makes it very problematic, but also interesting. So, to the question of normative authority, that I take to be the question that underlies the worry about supervenience. Kantian constructivism responds that normative authority is rational authority. And so natural properties are normative properties if they have some normative force. Having normative force means having authority. That kind of authority is based on the fact that they are the products of some kind of reasoning, and it's for a theory of practical reasoning to explain what makes it authoritative in a genuine way, or what it makes it simply powerful or motivational, committing and so forth. So in this view, on this view, construction stands for practical reflection. Practical subjects are the real, the starting point of this doctrine. And for practical subjects, I intend evaluator. I want to select evaluators endowed with specific cognitive and practical requisite for the exercise of rational agency. They are mutually dependent, finite, and interested in pursuing their interest and satisfying their particular needs. These are very generic qualifications, but they're detailed enough to separate this sort of theory from other sorts of idealized view of theory of practical reason. We can go in the discussion, we can go into details, but this is too. The reason why this theory is a direct competitor with robust realism is that Kant thinks that when we are talking about rational justification, we are talking about a specific form of self-legislation. And so the legal analogy and the extension of the legal analogy to moral analogy for Kant is not an extension. This is the way in which reasoning works. It's the way in which the idea of practical reasoning is to be understood. And the immediate objection that Kant already anticipated is that when we are legislating about ourselves, when we are legislating from our own standpoint, the authority of the obligations or of the normative judgment that we are producing seems to be unstable, right? Because we seem to be at a liberty of destroying by the next decree what we have already produced in the first step. And so Kant says, it might be objected that when we are trying to impose obligations, the fact that the author and the subject of the obligation is the same person, then the very act of self-legislation is contradictory, right? There is a way out to this problem that Kant produces, but this is an objection that resurfaced in the debate, and more recently is Anscombe has this problem, but more recently Alan Wood voices this concern against constructivism. Now, the way out is to develop Kant's own solution of the problem, understanding the forensic analogy, the legal analogy, as not as much as an act of monological, say, self-legislation, but as an act of co-legislation. That is, when we are introducing the analogy, what we are trying to do, what's the purpose of the analogy is, it's not to collapse, to have the subject and the object of the legislation collapse, but to have two voices distinguished in the exercise of reasoning about what to do, or what to think, or what to desire, or what to feel. And so the source of authority is not that particular factual being that starts the reasoning. The source of authority is the process of legislation. And in the process of legislation, it is constitutive of the project of legislation, that you're taking the other one as co-legislating. The other one is, of course, anybody that is qualified as a practical subject, as in the first step of the account of Kantian constructivism. Right. Now, at this point, there is an important objection voiced by many, but in particular by Williams. The objection is that this is a moralized view of practical reasoning that encourages a mischaracterization of the place of morality in our life. And Williams was worried that if we accept this moralized conception of practical reasoning, then morality becomes a source of reasons that trump all the other reasons. And he was objecting, as you may know, I mean, overridingness and overridingness as a way to understand the sovereignty or the probably what Carla was thinking about, the categoricity of moral reasons. So it is a worry that this theory generates, that there might be a gap between the normativity of moral reasons and the normativity of practical reasoning, that reasons that Kantian constructivism doesn't know how to, or cannot solve. Right? Now, a way to solve it is to think of co-legislators not as persons having equal standing from a metaphysical point of view, but as peers. And so when you are constructing the co-legislations, you are reasoning with others and in the attempt to build a common kind of ground. And you start considering others as peers in a very basic and not much demanding from a metaphysical point of view. So parity here is basically a comparative normative category. It doesn't rest on any metaphysical and empirical equality, and so it doesn't have to argue for equality from a metaphysical or an empirical point of view. It doesn't require any input conditions such as equal formal qualifications or computational ability. It does not imply that two peers always perform equally well, nor does it imply that they have equal access to the same epistemic resources or to the same epistemic domain. And so it doesn't aim to protect a moral value. This is basically the main difference between this form of Kantian constructivism and other forms of Kantian constructivism, such as Christine Korsgaard. With this, I think we can go forward attacking the problem of supervenience as a problem that is generated by a worry. And the worry isn't so much the metaphysical grounding, but the fear that if we lose naturalistic grounding or some other kind of foundation, then we are basically left with arbitrary considerations. Now, the solution to the problem of arbitrariness is not a metaphysical solution and is not a moralistic solution. The solution is to appeal to universality in a way that select the relation between normative properties and descriptive properties as a communal or, again, dialogical work that you do with members of the same community, where the same community can vary and it is descripted in a very factual ways. I mean, it doesn't involve any metaphysical component. Parity here is a general constraint about reasoning in general. So, for example, you find this concern both in practical and in theoretical reasoning. It doesn't pertain solely to moral considerations. Arbitrary considerations may be called unfair, but arbitrary considerations in theoretical reasoning are dogmatic. They are considerations that convince only those who are in your own group, belong to your narrow group, but don't have general authority. They don't have general authority because they have an authority that is grounded on considerations that not everybody shares, not everybody in the larger group of peers. And so whenever peers disagree, there is a problem. And the solution is to detect some test or to propose some text that detects, again, arbitrariness, special pleading, or dogmatism. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this part is that in this way, I think it's obvious that the problem is not moralizing reasoning. The problem is to find rational argumentation that show that authority, normative authority, both in the practical and in the theoretical domain, is authority that is produced by reason. So it's rational authority. And I take this to be showing that there are some, at least some norms, one of which is parity, some requirements that are constitutive of reasoning in general, again, both practical and theoretical. And of course, you may have small groups of selections of relations between normative and descriptive properties, and the scope of these reasons relations depend on the relevant community that you're referring to. So uniformity is not an outcome of this account of practical reason. Some clarification here. I think I have some time again. The clarification here might be that self-legislation is a reflexive term but doesn't commit to anything like privileging your own positions. And the idea, again, is that this is avoided by constraints that are internal to the activity of practical reasoning. So in this way, we have an account that may offer a connection between general and specific supervenience. Co-legislation serves the purpose of laying down the structure of practical rationality. To this extent, it creates the legislative authority and sets its limit. And within this authority, within this legislative space, then a lot other questions about specific supervenience may be approached. But this is a general view that relates general and specific supervenience. So one other objection against this view, it might be that queerness arises. Again, this is a view that has been recently voiced by Hussain and Shaw, and the objection is based on the mistaken idea that normative facts are created out of nothing. But again, the view is that there are constraints on this creation, so the construction doesn't amount to a mere creation. It's generative of normative properties, but this generation is controlled and it is governed by norms that are constitutive of practical reasoning. So the constructivist reply is that it's generative, but it's not a creationist view. It doesn't merely produce arbitrarily normative properties. And there is no subject matter of the moral domain that makes some worries such as Williams rise about the moral, the sovereignty of moral properties to be a problem for practical reasons. So I think there are two sorts of advantages that we may identify. These are general advantages. One is that Kantian constructivism is not vulnerable to the objection of queerness in the same way in which any other anti-realist view is. But although this is not an anti-cognitivist view, it is an anti-realist view in a certain way. But the most important advantage, in my view, is epistemological, because Kantian constructivism offers a general practical justification of normative principles that works both at the normative and at the metaethical level, so it bridges specific and general supervenience in a way that David Enoch doesn't do, and it works both in the practical and in the theoretical domain. So there are specific advantages versus robust realism. Robust realism doesn't offer the same kind of full-fledged normative theory, I think, and also it avoids normative questions that instead arise pertinently and urgently, exactly because the robust realist view wants to resolve the issue of specific supervenience by appealing to principles, and views very, very openly. Kantian constructivism views supervenience as a response to arbitrariness, and therefore the importance of supervenience is not primarily metaphysical and semantic, but it's practical, I would say. Right? So you may say the realist also may respond to arbitrariness by anchoring normative properties to natural properties. What I mean by anchoring here is basically grounding, right? Any form of strong grounding. Or another question might be, but why not doing, defending supervenience without principles? Because it might be that the ontology of supervenience doesn't follow the opposite. The epistemology of supervenience doesn't follow the ontology of supervenience. Now, these questions would require much more discussions, I think. But I think there are reasons why it is preferable not to defend supervenience by appealing to particularist conceptions of moral perception. And I have given these replies in other papers. But briefly, my impression is that we can vindicate the role of principles at the level of organizing reflective experience, and giving up the organizing role of experience at the level, giving up the role of organizing experience seems to me a cost that we cannot afford in a theory of practical reasoning, because we would end up with a theory of practical reasons that offers a mere procedure or a mere decision procedure for selecting what to do, without an account of why practical subjects, need to, or practically need to endorse any theory at all. And so my view is that we cannot possibly do without practical reason or reasons in general, and we cannot understand reasons unless we understand reasons in a principled way. So the conclusions, finally, is that, in my view, Kantian constructivism completes the sort of explanation that David Enoch suggested for specific supervenience. But in this completion, there are a lot of more elements that seem to me preferable. Not only that it's a larger view that puts in relation the specific and the general sort of supervenience, but it responds to other worries that anti-realists have about the normative function of discourse. And more importantly, I think, it shows that practical reasoning in this domain is not just pertinent, but also essential to solve some problems in metaethics. And this is especially direct to those people such as Hussein Shah and Enoch, who suggested that Kantian constructivism is not a metaethical theory, but simply a theory of practical reason. It is simply a theory of practical reason, but some problems of metaethics can be solved only if you have a theory of practical reasoning. That's my final conclusions about normative supervenience. Thank you.
It's really a very ambitious program. But I was surprised that you describe Kantian constructivism as a kind of naturalism. You just stipulate that rationality is normative. But if you take rationality to be normative, and then you say that rational people, to be rational is a natural property. You're kind of begging the question against the naturalists.
Yes. So there is obviously we can define naturalism in different ways. So part of the constructivist program in for example, The Sources of Normativity by Christine Korsgaard is to defend some sort of naturalism. So there is a sort of less, a definition of naturalism that doesn't involve a naturalistic reduction. This is the view that what one what you are describing when you are, for example, giving an account of rational agency. You are not introducing anything like noumena or a metaphysical status for rational agents in the way in which some sort of interpretation of Kantian theory does or did. And so Kantian constructivists such as Scanlon or Korsgaard do define themselves as naturalists in a certain sense. Of course, they're not committed to naturalistic reduction. That's why we are talking about constructions rather than reductions.
Yes, I understand that. I mean, even Jungians,
Yes,
expressivists
exactly.
can call themselves naturalists, but then they appeal only to psychological features of agents, and the normativity is not put into the mind.
Yes.
So
What I put into the mind is only self-reflexivity. So the presumption here is that the mind is self-reflexive, and this is a natural feature of the mind, and this is sufficient to. This is actually the naturalistic route for self-legislation or co-legislation, is that the mind is at least from a phenomenological point of view, works in such a way that we can have thoughts about our own mental states, and this is sufficient for the purpose of this theory to start a dialogical concern. And the idea is that there is nothing strange or queer about self-reflexivity. Something that Heidrich Frankfurt, being not a Kantian, might endorse, and yet is sufficient to introduce normativity.
Yes, maybe my problem is just I don't see how you can get normativity out of self-reflection alone. I never understood that, but it's my problem, perhaps.
But this is not something that pertains only to Kantian theories.
No, I know.
Right?
I know.
If you attack this, you attack this on other grounds than being anti-Kantian, right?
Okay,
because this is something that concerns Velleman, Street, Frankfurt,
I know. Okay.
Bratman, and a long list of other people.
Yeah. Vellman.
Yes.
Antonino?
It's just a short comment, because actually we discussed a lot during the flight from Italy to Canada. So the comment is, so comment could be, Habermas says that universalizability is a way for jumping from facts into norms, right? So it's basically, you said, we discussed during the flight. Actually, I see the same point. The normative supervenience is a way for jumping into the normative, right? And Habermas says, that principle, works exactly as induction works in the case of factual reasoning. By induction you jump from particular judgments into universal judgments. So is it correct, this view? I mean, do you see yourself in this pictorial view? And if so, do you think that is a good metaphor for investigating formal properties of this jump? In this debate, one less charitable way to put it is to say that Kantian constructivism commits some kind of bootstrapping, right, rather than anchoring, and I endorse it. I think it's a sort of bootstrapping. The bootstrapping is the move, not so much the move that makes the step between self-reflexivity and normativity, but I think the move that makes it so that when you are self-legislating, or you are imagining yourself as a co-legislator, then you are producing something normative. And so producing means that you are introducing. It's a generative step. It's not different, as we discussed on the plane, it's not different from Searle, the way in which Searle talks about social, institutional, normative facts. It's a form of creation in a way. But comparing to Searle and comparing to other form of ontological constructivism, for example, what I think is less problematic here is that you are offering an account of the constraints. And the account of the constraints is not an account that appeals to metaphysical features or epistemological features that rely on the metaphysics. The plausibility points that I think Kantian constructivism has on this very topic is that it explains the problem of supervenience as a problem of narrow local authority of some normative judgments, and says, if the local authority is justified by the fact that is endorsed in a certain community of peers, that's all right. That means that, for example, it is okay, that it is fine to have moral differences insofar as you have done enough of dialogical work that there is nothing more to say or to build. And so it is a rational construction as opposed to mere ontological construction that is justified on the at the level of authority. You're trying to give an account of authority that is that takes a universal audience as a target rather than starting from an act of power or a sheer act of decision like in Searle.
I was wondering about the queerness objection. As I understand one version of it, Mackey's problem is with the idea that moral properties would need to literally tell you to do things. They'd need to literally favour you doing things, and that this is kind of crazy because, well, I mean, it'd be crazy even if you're a naturalist. Natural properties, how on earth does a natural property tell one to do something? It's crazy if you're a non-naturalist as well, because how does a non-natural property tell you to do something? So I assume that with your view, you're saying that these norms, these favourings, are favourings that we ourselves are issuing to ourselves. Is that how you account for the normativity of reasons? Or is it that there are some apparent norms that we are inescapably, as agents, compelled to endorse? Because my problem with the latter is that no amount of showing how inescapable it is that we have to endorse certain norms will transform them into real favourings. Just because I have to take something to be a favouring doesn't make it into one, no matter how inescapable it is. So even if my status as an agent compels me to take there to be certain norms that apply to me and that are authoritative for me, well, that doesn't make them into real favourings so far as I can see. If there are some pebbles on a beach that tell me, that spell out get off the beach, if I find out that they've just been washed up by the sea, I conclude that there's no real favouring going on there. I'm not actually disfavoured being on the beach. If it was by some sort of cosmic hypnotism the case that I just couldn't help but see that arrangement of pebbles as issuing me an instruction, that wouldn't, to my mind, make it into one. So that's what I was wondering. How does the inescapability give you an answer to the queerness objection? Because you'd need somehow to make the inescapability yield real favourings, and that's what that's what I'm sort of wondering about. Unless you say,
what do you mean exactly by real favourings?
Well, I take it that reasons are favourings. I would take that to be a conceptual truth about reasons. That reasons are favourings of acts and attitudes, and thus that's the queerness problem. Is that we somehow need to account for how there can be favourings of acts and attitudes. Pointing out that we can't help but take there to be such things, to my mind, doesn't explain how there could be. It shows how we're invested in the existence of such things, but it doesn't explain how they could actually exist. The queerness objection, to my mind, remains. How can there just be favourings? And so the non-naturalist just says, well, there just can be. I think that's not acceptable. The naturalist says that they're natural properties. Well, how can a natural property favour you doing something? As I understand it on the Kantian, on this sort of constitutivist view, it's because we're compelled to take there to be such favourings. But that, to my mind, won't really answer the queerness objection. It's kind of subtly exchanging it for a different problem. It's explaining how we're invested. So it kind of explains why these favourings are authoritative for us. We can't help but care what reason favours us doing. But it doesn't explain how reason favours us doing things, or how reasons are favourings. It just says that we are kind of...
You're saying the metaphysics of it. It doesn't give the metaphysics of it.
Yeah, well, it doesn't answer the queerness objection, is what I'd
No,
say.
It does answer the queerness objection.
Yeah, but
because we can explain... Basically what it says is that the normative... In order to give an account of the normative properties, all you need to do is to give an account of the authority.
Oh, that's what
And
I'm saying. That's false, though, isn't it? Because you can't show something to be a favouring just by showing that you're inescapably invested in it being one.
But that's not the answer that we are given. The answer that we are given is exactly the opposite. Not that because we are invested, so much so that there is Kant is the one who introduced the notion of categoricity and conditionality of moral obligations. So we do, for sure, have obligations that count against our desires, preferences, and so forth, right? So we do want to defend categoricity.
I agree with all that. Yeah, yes.
And categorical obligations are obligations that don't arise simply by our concocting self-legislation stories. But
yes, I agree.
But I think the idea here is that you can provide a basis for the categorical authority of reasons, talking about the self-reflexive process of reasoning, right? So to uncover the structure of reasoning, that's the answer that the constitutivist is offering. And so when you're asking for some further level of the metaphysics of reasons, I guess the point of the constructivism is to avoid the metaphysics of it. So you're asking a question that we are trying to give an alternative to the question you're asking. I mean, you're positing a question as a realist would, but I don't. That to me, this is this is what generates the problem of queerness. To understand the categoricity of normative properties as if the only way to defend it is to go the realist way, talking about tracking facts. What you're not saying is that normative facts is not something that we are tracking. It's something that we are building through a proper activity regulated by some norms, and then those norms are constitutive. Right. So I don't think it's a conceptual truth that if you have categorical reasons, then you have favorings of these metaphysical kinds. That's exactly the point about constructivism.
So you're saying reasons aren't favorings?
I don't. If by favorings you think of metaphysics. I think that the questions of how you build it, the ontogenesis of those reasons, explains the normative force. So the normative force is explained by uncovering how reasoning works. And there is no other, it's done. When you are uncovering those mechanisms, you're done your job. There is no further question. The objection is answered. The objection of queerness, as Mackey puts it.
I suppose that's yes.
So Mackey obviously, I had in mind both Moore and Kant. In fact, he had the same argument against Moore and Kant in inventing right or wrong, right? But the sort of Kant he had in mind is a realist interpretation of Kant. But what I think Kantian constructivism is offering in reply is an account of the authority of moral and normative properties that doesn't rely on anything metaphysical. Mm-hmm. This is not because there aren't normative properties. You can talk about normative properties, but normative properties are basically, to make those phrases explicit, you have to refer to how the normative property is constructed. And it is constructed by the functioning of normative principle, exactly the way in which David Enoch, who is a realist, does, right? So my point is that we are not doing anything up to that point. We are not doing anything different than a realist metaphysician, say. What we are adding is uncovering, supplying a further explanation of how those normative properties and how to select those normative principles that do the work. Because the work is done by principles, not by metaphysics.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to ask the same question again, just to try to see if I understand your answer. So, take the reason for relation. That's a normative relation.
Yes.
So a reason for performing an action is a consideration in favor of performing the action, as he was saying.
Yes.
Right. And then it sounds like you're saying you're giving an account of what that normative relation consists in. So R would count as a reason in favor of action. R is counting as a reason in favor of action A, just consists in, and you're going to fill in the blank. Now what you're going to fill in the blank with, is that normative or non-normative?
Normative.
It's normative. Okay. So the question's going to kind of reoccur.
That's
then
why I
for
called it the
that.
bootstrapping. Yeah. I mean, in that sense, it is bootstrapping, right? Because I'm not anchoring anything like a normative property onto anything fixed that is a natural property. But it is important to see that this bootstrapping is generating something that is not facing the same sort of objection that Mackey had against realism and entirety, or.
So it wouldn't be an objection to say, well, then you're just saying, look, queer properties are unavoidable, like Platz was saying. Look, the world's a queer place. It's loaded with these queer properties. You don't want to just be saying that.
No, I don't want to say this, because I think it's enough if we say that there are some capacities, such as reflexivity, that generates normative property, normative relations.
But self-reflection or self-consciousness, is that itself a normative notion?
Not according to these accounts.
If it's not, but even though that's not a normative notion, you don't think you can give an account of what a reason for an action
directly
just consists in non-normative terms. You're going to invoke the idea of self-consciousness, but that's not enough. You're going to have to bring in other normative terms to
yes.
give
Yes.
the account.
So the self-reflexivity is the descriptive feature of the mind that Kantians and non-Kantians alike invoke in order to generate the need for practical reasoning, right? So if you are a self-reflexive mind, you just don't act according to your desire immediately, but supposedly you may ask, do I want to drink right now, right? You're not just drink and so
it's really not an account of what grounds that relation. You're not.
It's not a grounding relation, because you may go different ways, and the reason that you select a path may not be the reason that is a stronger reason, so you need the reason why you need that path, and the favoring reason, say the favoring, what you call favoring, is something that requires a principle. That's the principle is something that you construct in this kind of dialogical way, and you may of course object to different details of the Kantian account at that stage, but the work is already done. I mean, maybe we are discussing the details, but if you accept self-reflexivity, and if you accept that you may have normative relations that are not grounding relations, this is all I need from a supervenience point of view. And I think this solution is preferable than the robust realist solution.
If we stay within a constructivism point of view,
Yes.
what would you say that encourages us to take a Kantian constructivism instead of Humean constructivism, such as Sharon Street defend or something
Good.
around that?
Yes, that's a good question. So because it's a good question because there are many reasons why the Humean constructivist might seem more appealing, especially if you want to avoid queerness and all other. But I think if you so first of all, what's Humean constructivism, right? Because the starting point for Sharon Street's attempt to leave the Kantian constructivism starting point is the exactly concern the division between moral and normative properties, right? So it seems to me that this is a concern that within the Kantian constructivist literature may already find an answer. We don't need to accord anything like a special authority to moral reasons. And this is because moral reasons are not the starting points of practical reasoning. They are the outcome. Mm-hmm. And so what happens to be a moral reason? It doesn't have to be devoided or separated, severe from a practical reason. In so much so that there is no account of, no critique of moral reason in Kant. There is a critique of practical reason because you think there is a continuity between moral and practical reasoning. So I think William's concern about the relation between moral and practical reasoning is an important concern, but is a concern that Kantian constructivism can respond to very well without endorsing Humean perspective. And the reason why, so this, I think, it's a misconception of the problem. I mean, if they decided to go toward Humean constructivism for this reason, then I think it's a mistaken reason. Then there is another reason why I don't want to go the way Sharon Street does. And this is because Sharon Street doesn't talk about construction at all. I don't think her view is a constructivist view. I'm not alone in this criticism. I have a companion who is David Kopp. So David Kopp is a constructivist. He's an Hobbesian constructivist. He's not a Kantian constructivist. And we both think that the way in which Humean constructivism has been defended doesn't involve any sort of construction. And this is crucial for Kantian constructivism. For my view, thinking of practical reflection as a construction, this is not just a metaphor. It means that you are doing something else than projection, than an inference from, or so it's a specific way of understanding practical reasoning. It's a practical reasoning that doesn't have starting points, basically, the way in which measure premises and conclusions in a deductive form. And nothing like construction happens in Sharon Street's view. So it is an entirely realist view, but it's not a constructivist view. That's why I don't want to go that way.
It's still not very clear to me exactly how this kind of account is. What do you claim exactly about supervenience? Are you saying something like, well, since norms are to come out from this process of construction or self-reflection, and these processes of reasoning are natural processes, then in that sense we don't need a further claim of supervenience because it kind of comes out of that the very natural processes just create or construct the normative facts, and in that sense you don't need a separate claim of supervenience because it's kind of it's immediately apparent. Is that the point?
Yes, the point is that, my problem started with the way, for example, Richard Hare talks of supervenience very early on, right? Hare introduces the notion of supervenience as a form of universalizability to address the arbitrariness question. And it's an interesting comparison, Hare and Moore, although nobody reads Hare anymore, but it was an important, I mean, it's one of the first who is talking about supervenience, right? So Hare is somebody who is thinking of supervenience in a Kantian way, although of course in an entire realist way, in a different way than what I'm trying to do here. And he thought that this was a theory that could respond to the issue of supervenience, grounding supervenience on the semantic, structural supervenience in a semantic way. So supervenience is grounded on the semantic structure of practical judgments. But it is something that it's supposed to work against arbitrariness. It blocks arbitrariness, bias, special pleading, and all sorts of concerns that are rooted in a favoring yourself as a specific source of authority, right? And this, I think, the fact that this was a practical concern for the problem of supervenience within ethics has been lost. Now the problem seems to be the metaphysics and how we take into account the metaphysics, whether it's queer or not. And I would like to go back to the original reason why we introduce, analytic philosophers introduce supervenience in the ethics debate. Now, to that question, I'm answering, we don't need, supervenience, once we explained it, and the way in which, for example, Hare explained it earlier on, refers to principle, universal principle, in a constitutive way. So supervenience is understood to be principled, as opposed to supervenience, say, the way in which Dancy defends it or other people defend it. And the Kantian constructivist account show that there is an explanation for supervenience that, as much as David Enoch's explanation refers to to normative principle in general. And so it shows that the philosophical work against arbitrariness is done by referring to principles. And this is interesting to me, even from an historical point of view, because going back to Hare, it's very funny because Hare talks of supervenience in the way in which he talks about universalizability. So he basically thought that the mere talk of universalizability was taking care of all the problems that supervenience could solve or avoid. Kantian constructivism offers a better explanation. Why is better? Because it shows that the problem is not the semantic problem. So supervenience or universalizability is not rooted in anything semantic. It's not a conceptual necessity. It is a necessity. It's a sort of, if you want to talk that way, it's a practical necessity. It's something that we need to do within the normative and the practical domain. But it can be explained by a theory of practical reasoning, not by a conceptual analysis as Hare intended to do.
On your analysis, if I'm right in understanding your position, we have to, as rational deliberators, endorse certain principles, but couldn't one say, well, it doesn't, but they don't have to be any, it doesn't have to be any particular principle or set of principles. There are lots of different collections, and any one of those will do. And then, but now you can't respect the supervenience thesis.
Yeah, I think I've discussed this somehow, but
I
couldn't read everything I wrote. But yes, I think this is a problem that arises for Enoch. Enoch can explain supervenience referring to utilitarianism, not because he endorses utilitarianism, I suppose. It doesn't have an account of a normative theory in the book, but it says, just pick this example, and this this example would explain the relation between normative and... Now, I think Kantian constructivism is in a position to explain why you need to choose this particular body of normative principles. And and that's what I meant by saying that one advantage is that it gives a sort of full-fledged account of the meta-ethical, meta-normative, and the normative content of principles. So it's not that once you have explained supervenience in terms of this generic appeal to principle, then you pick up whatever set of normative principle you like. I mean, there are constraints, and those constraints might be loose enough to allow for a variety of moral principles. And so you may not be, under the pressure to decide between utilitarianism and Kantian theory on this particular case. It might be convergence. In some other cases, you may have indications that are more precise. And the reason why I'm not telling this in advance, because what's the content of moral principle is the outcome of deliberation. And this deliberation, the only constraints we have is that you take the other one as a peer in this very minimal, modest sense. That is something in the middle between Kantians and Humeans, right? Because it doesn't preserve anything metaphysical from the Kantian perspective, original Kantian perspective. So in that sense, it is a concession to Humean kinds of constructivism.
So these other forms of constructivism that leave it open, just a whole range of plausible normative theories could be.
I think constructivists in general leave it open.
Right.
Even Kopp, who is the one who
Right.
did more in terms of content, but they do allow that there is some kind of convergence among
Right.
actual normative theories.
Because there'd need to be. So you're saying then there needs to be once you get a convergence, then you can explain supervenience. Otherwise,
No. What I said is that in order to explain supervenience, you have to refer to normative principle. At that stage, you may find out that what you are selecting as the relevant relation is something that both Kantians, Humeans, and Hobbesian think is right. But this is something like it's a ex post facto discovery. It's not because you endorse an Hobbesian theory of normative reasons and then you're producing the norms. It's the opposite. First, you're trying to build a sort of imaginary dialogue with your peers, and it happens, that the norm that suggests that you have to save, the infant is the very same one that both Hobbesian and Humean endorse. That's just, it would be nice if we all agree, as
Right.
Parfit likes it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Very much.